the aftermath is something that I'm going to come back to. This is the fourth section of this lecture in the next lecture. But in brief, it can be summed up this way. Basically, there was 5 solid weeks of bombing of Iraq. Once a modernized country, now had no reliable electrical grid. It was just destroyed. The medical systems were destroyed. Waterworks were destroyed. Civilians, certainly in the tens of thousands, had been killed by this imprecise standard iron or dumb bombs, as I've talked about. These iron bombs just drop, basically, and so you don't know where they go, as opposed to all the smart weapons, which we'll be talking about, and surgical strikes, which supposedly happened. The Patriot missiles, which were so much talked about at the time, this was another one of these propaganda things where the Patriot missiles apparently so well protected Israel that one of the biggest fears was that Israel would use a nuclear weapon, which we know Israel has. They don't admit to it. It's like, but we know they have nuclear weapons, and the terror was that Israel was going to say, drop bomb, begin to carpet bomb Palestine, but specifically that Israel was going to go to war with Iran. And this was the great fear, that it would not only would it use nuclear weapons on Iran and, of course, devastate the human population, but also the real fear from the United States was that it would irradiate and leave radioactively hot the battlefields and the oil fields which were underneath them. So the real terror on the United States' behalf was, please don't let the Israelis bomb Iran. We need the oil. Everybody needs the oil, and we can't afford to have a desert which has been irradiated and is hot. It's so hot that people can't go in and survive. If you happen to kill all the Iranians, oh well, they were Muslim anyway, and they were brown people. We don't really care. But please don't destroy the oil. So what was a modernized country, Iraq, isn't after the end of this kind of bombing. Most of the highly developed cities are down in the south and sort of go up. There's a sort of little spur of highly developed cities. Those were all wiped out and pretty much destroyed. The Patriot missiles, which, as I say, were supposed to have been the only way, at the moment, the only way to counter a missile is with another missile. So somebody launches a missile, you launch your missiles that are attack those missiles. So they're ground launch attack missiles. Sometimes called GLICMs, as opposed to SLICMs, ground launch missiles, countermeasures, GLICMs, SLICMs, sub-launch countermeasures. These missile batteries were established in the public's mind as an enormous success. It turns out, actually, that the Patriots mostly failed. I think like one of them actually behaved properly, but they went off course, they blew up, they did the things that missiles often do, which is it's a very expensive way to fight a war. I mean, these missiles are massively expensive. Let me go back to this. George Herbert Walker Bush declares publicly and famously in one of his post-war addresses, and he says, quote, "It's a proud day for America, and by God, we've kicked the Vietnam syndrome once and for all." Right? Now, these were remarks made to the American Legislative Exchange Council, March 1st, 1991. And the speech immediately became famous for this particular line. It's otherwise sort of a dull, typical, political speech. But this is the okay, so I'll put this up on a slide, right? So here it is. Here's this famous statement. And in many ways, this statement about the Vietnam syndrome is as important in the 90s and to the discussion of the 90s and what's going to happen in the lead up to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan as was Rambo's "Do we get to win this time?" statement. They framed the discussion. It was very, really, you had to acknowledge when you were talking about Vietnam in the 90s that Bush had said this, that there's such a thing as a Vietnam syndrome as far as the right wing was concerned, and that they kicked it. And in this, in 100 hours, with overwhelming force, and the destruction of a country, that basically the emasculation that had occurred to once proud and strong America had been fixed, that the bad man had been driven out and back to his lair, basically. Now, what you have to remember about this is that they didn't kill Saddam. Well, why not? Right? This was the big question. They rolled up and they stopped. They rolled up to Baghdad and they stopped. Well, why did they stop? Why didn't they knock over the country? I mean, after all, if Saddam was so bad, why didn't they knock him out? They were all ready. They had 700,000 people on the ground, plus all the people in the air and the boats and all the other stuff, and they'd been massing for 3 months. They were ready. If there was ever a time to essentially put a new regime in Iraq, this would presumably have been it, if you were thinking that way. But they stopped. So, why? And why did George W. Bush, the son, go in and not stop? Because if there was ever a time not to knock over a country, that was it. When you're engaged in another war. So there's been a great deal of theorizing about what exactly happened. In March 1991, Bush encouraged the Shia, in other words, the majority population, and the Kurdish population. The Kurds are a people, and they go across the north parts of Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan, and Turkey. They cross this, which is why there have been proposals every now and then that there should be the formation of Kurdistan. What would be Kurdistan? Because the Kurdish people are a different people. It's a different group. They're different belief systems. It's a whole different thing. And the Kurds almost always fight with and in support of the United States and vice versa. So they tend to be allies. Okay. So anyway, Bush says, okay, well, we finished our war, and as promised, this is part of the Powell Doctrine, we're going to leave, right? But we encourage the Shia and the Kurds and the Shia to rise up and overthrow Saddam, right? In other words, you guys should have a revolution, which is what my father would have called a game of let's you and him fight, where, you walk into a bar and you get a couple of other people who seem like they're ready for a punch-up into a fight with each other. Then you stand back and go, oh, this is a lot of fun. This is great. Let's see who wins. Assuming that the U.S. Would support this kind of rebellion, two groups did exactly this. They did rise up, and they were massacred by Saddam's troops. And the U.S. and the coalition watched and did nothing. So, when we get to this discussion of jus in bello, that is, how you are pursuing the war, it's like, well, why did they do that? If you encourage a rebellion or a revolution and then you don't support it, you're like, oh, wow, you're just too bad. Hey, geez, I wish you'd had more support. But, well, So what this means is that not only was Saddam left in place, but he now understood that the united governments of the world were against him. So if he had been paranoid before, now he really became nuts. I mean, this was, to use the technical term, now he faced severe sanctions by the world on what can be imported, particularly technology that might be put to military uses. So now the world governments lock Iraq up, and they prevent stuff from getting in. They have what are so-called no-fly zones in the north part of the country and in the southern part of the country. And this requires an enormous amount of flying by the air forces involved. The French, the Brits, the Canadians, I think, are actually part of the no-fly. I think so. And the Americans, of course. And what these are bands, basically, geographic bands in the country where the Air Force patrols, and the Iraqis are not permitted to fly there, so they're not allowed to get jets out, and they're not allowed to fly their fighter jets at all. At least that's not happening. So anything that and that means that you're surveilling them to see what are they doing. Are they massing on the ground? So everybody's focused on Iraq. And the satellites are focused on Iraq and so on. This is before drones. So the sanctions and embargoes that begin to work on Iraq, of course, affect military equipment. But guess what else? Requires high tech, computers. The same kinds of parts. Lots of silver gold connectors, and the gold in the circuits, silver in the circuits, and so on. Because you use precious metals for making technical parts of all kinds. Well, medical supplies. So what happens is that the medical equipment, which has been up to date. I mean, Iraq, people used to go to Iraq for medical procedures. That is, people in the Middle East would leave their countries and go to Iraq to have medical procedures done. So these hospitals were state of the art in the 80s. Well, not anymore, right? Not after 10 years of war, basically between Iraq and Iran, and then 100 hours of complete and utter destruction by the quote-unquote coalition, plus the embargoes and sanctions. So now you've got what was a medical leader in the Middle East soon becomes a dreadfully dangerous place to get sick, because the most basic medicines are being denied to the country, and it's punishment. It's pure and simple. Basically, the idea is that if you punish the people long enough, they will rise up and put out the ruler. That's the idea. It's the same kind of thinking as a strike. A strike isn't aimed at. It ultimately is aimed at the employer. But the way you punish the employer is by punishing the people who need the service. So if it's a transit strike, you need to piss off a couple of million people who need to get to work today. And after a few weeks, they go to the government as citizens and say, we don't care what it takes. Go make it right. Settle with these striking workers. And we need the subways to run, or whatever it is. Or if it's a school teachers union on strike, same thing, right? As you drive people nuts because they have to deal with their kids at home, and it just screws up their work, it screws up their lives. The kids go crazy because they're bored. All the usual stuff that we're seeing now with COVID, right? Except with COVID, there's nowhere to argue, because you can't argue with the virus. There's no court. You can't say, well, virus, we're unhappy. So basically, the pressure, you're putting pressure on the people you want to get by proxy, right? So you hurt this group, and you expect this group to go up against that group. Okay, same thing here. So basically, the thinking was, well, we'll just effectively torture the civilian population so much that they will throw Saddam out. And the United States and the coalition in general, that is the coalition of the billing, as it came to be called, because they all billed the United States. They were like, okay, well, we'll stay, but it's going to cost you money. And so the United States actually had to pay. This happened even more during the Iraq War. So they called it traditionally it was the coalition of the willing, and then it became the coalition of the billing. But the thing about Saddam was that if Iraqis were being hurt, well, he was already nuts. He was like, okay, well, suck it up. I mean, as long as it's not the Sunni minority that's hurting, he had enough power to protect his in-group and protect himself. I mean, by this time, he was wearing these golden guns, and his sons, Uday, and I can't remember the names of the sons. One of them, they made movies about them. I mean, they were crazy. If things weren't crazy enough, as the Iraqi army pulled back and the Americans were moving forward, so then I'm going back in time to the end of the 100 hours, basically, of war, the Iraqis lit on fire many of the oil fields. And this required and they created this massive disaster, this environmental disaster. Plus, they were burning oil. And the fires just raged for months. And so the Americans had to put together, the world really, but it was largely an American-run operation, had to put together teams of people who were experienced in blowing out oil wells.
The sheer scale of the Kuwait Fires project was unlike any previous oil field disaster. Hundreds of blazing wells, severely damaged well heads, lakes of oil, air so black that even headlights couldn't penetrate more than a few feet. Most of Kuwait's damaged oil wells were ablaze, sending flames hundreds of feet into the air. The first priority was to extinguish the flames so crews could move in and kill the wells. Depending on the type of fire, foam was frequently used in conjunction with dry chemicals.
To prevent further massacres, there were these no-fly zones and around the Shia and Kurdish population, so they were protected, basically, until the end of the Second Gulf War, which was supposed to have ended in 2003. Later for that. There were also depleted uranium rounds that were burned in these 100 hours in the pushing of the troops out of Kuwait and back into Iraq, basically pushing them back up. And these rounds, I'll show you some pictures of these later, but basically the results are like the results with Agent Orange, where this was considered to be a low-level atomic war that was, I can't say that it was non-nuclear, but what happened was that basically nuclear material was powdered and then spread into the sand by this particular weapon, and I'll talk about this. And both the United States and Britain have main battle tanks who use these depleted uranium rounds, and they refuse to admit or agree that this needed to be cleaned up. And so as a result, they left behind contaminated farmland, and the depleted material, which is radioactive, which is very, very fine, like a powder-like substance, went into the water supply. And so, as they say, it has been considered that they fought a low-level nuclear war. Not considered, it's been claimed, I mean, and I think realistically so, without exploding nuclear weapons. And this has been considered by some to be nuclear terrorism, and I'm okay with that. I think that's reasonable. All right. So, what do we have? What do we have for the contestants today, Johnny? Which we now know is from The Price is Right, which I never really watched. Okay, so here's the final slide for today. Final note about this. If you're interested in reading one of the better discussions of how the media changed, basically, because of this particular war, have a look at John MacArthur's book, Second Front. It's really well written, and MacArthur is a smart guy. He was the editor at Harper's, I want to say. Might have been the Atlantic. I can't remember now. Anyway, I'll put an image in of this book. I do recommend it if you're interested in this particular thing. There's lots to read, but this is not at all like Michael Hare. It's much more sort of documentary about what happened and what his assessment is as a person who was basically completely involved in trying to get the story as it was unrolling. Okay.